Uh, I see we've got quite a good audience. We've had over 1,000 people join us, and I always love looking at the maps afterwards to see where everybody's coming from all over the world. So it's very exciting. And with that, I'm going to start us off. Let me do the captions. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Wisdom Weekly's event, The Sea of Homer, with the one and only Emily Wilson. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, my name is Anya Leonard, and I am the founder and director of Classical Wisdom. We are a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And you can check us out on classicalwisdom.com. We're on Substack. You get a free newsletter. We've got free resources and all that good stuff for people who are excited about learning more of the ancient world. And today we're going to be discussing Homer, the one and only. Who was he? Do we know who he was? If he was one person, what do we know? Why does he matter? Getting into some of the nuts and bolts of the language itself, as well as the geography of Homer's world. And we're going to begin discussing this with Emily, and then we'll open up to a Q&A afterwards. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. Sean, our managing editor, is on the case. He will be helping curate questions as we go, and helping with the event. So if you have any issues, you can also write to him specifically. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our honored guest for today. Emily Wilson is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania and holds the College of Women's Class 1963 chair in humanities. She is an award-winning translator, best known for her widely acclaimed verse translations of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, which, as I've been joking, I'm getting my arm exercised by making sure everybody could see these fantastic editions. They're both beautiful and beautifully to read. She is also a MacArthur Fellow and Guggenheim Fellow. Emily has served as a distinguished guest lecturer on our previous In Search of Homer journey, and she will also be the distinguished guest lecturer on our upcoming The Sea of Homer, taking place in July. She'll be leading lectures and discussions that connect Homer's epics to landscape, ideas, and human questions that shape the ancient world. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining me today.
Thank you for talking to me. Thank you all for coming.
Well, it's fun seeing you in this space because the last time I saw you was in a restaurant in Kefalonia,
That's right.
and we had the whole Classical Wisdom crew. It was the last day of the tour. Everybody was in a very jolly mood, and
Mhm.
I think we kept the libations and celebrations going till quite late, though you very wisely turned in
I
before
went to
me.
bed earlier than you did, I think. You guys stayed up very late. Yes, I am an early bird. Yes,
No, but it was such a fun group. It was such a fun
it was
atmosphere.
fun.
Like it
It's really
was
nice.
just it was one of those situations too where like everybody had something interesting to say, and
Mhm.
I love that you could like talk about Aristotle and nobody would roll their eyes at you. I mean, I don't always get that pleasure, so
Mhm.
I was very
Yes.
happy.
Yeah.
But it was great that you could kind of get into the world of Homer there, and to kind of give you some of those insights to our audience today. So basically, we're going to be getting into why after 3,000 years we're still reading Homer at all. So maybe let's begin with the basics. I know a lot of people think they know Homer or think they don't know Homer, but who was Homer and why does he matter?
I mean, even the pronouns, like how many people were responsible for the creation of these monumental arm muscle generating epic poems? Those are difficult questions, and scholars call them the capital H, capital Q Homeric question, which is a cluster of different questions about how exactly did the Greek-speaking world go from a long oral tradition. We know that there were several centuries when the Greek-speaking world had no literacy. After the fall of Mycenaean civilization, that was the period in which the traditions on which these poems are based were developing, these both poetic forms, dactylic hexameter, this poetic rhythm, which was associated with the telling of the kleia andron, the famous deeds of quasi-historical, quasi-mythical men. But then in the 8th century, the Greek-speaking world became literate again using the Greek alphabet that we have now, on which our alphabet is based. And fairly soon after that, maybe in the 7th century, the poems of both Hesiod and Homer were produced, which are based on oral tradition, but of course they are written poems. And the question of who exactly produced these poems, in antiquity, it was said to be someone called Homeros. And there was a tradition that maybe he came from the island of Chios. But then there were other islands and other parts of the Greek-speaking world that said, oh, no, he came from here, because everyone wants to have the most famous poet as their guy, the local hero, the local guy. There were ancient traditions that he was blind. I mean, I think that in a way, the blindness of Homer is a tradition based on the blindness of Demodocus in the Odyssey. It's a way of talking about oral poetry, because if you're a blind performer, you don't need to be able to see text to produce your work. I tend to be a bit skeptical about the idea that we can actually prove anything for sure about was it the same person or two different people who produced the Iliad and the Odyssey. The poems are complementary. They're both about a warrior who gets separated from his community and then reintegrated in his community. They're both extraordinary and unusual in terms of the ways that they use pre-existing myth. They're also much longer than you could have a single oral performance after dinner. They take over 20 hours to perform out loud. So how exactly did they emerge from the oral tradition? I don't think we can actually fully answer that question. And I don't think we can fully answer the question of was it one person or more than one person who produced them. But I think we can say at some point in the 7th century, these poems came into being. And from that time onwards, more or less
Sorry, hold
continuously,
on a
they
second.
were listened to, performed, and then by Hellenistic times, studied by scholars in antiquity. So the texts that we have are based on the texts that were sort of formulated, gathered, collated by the Hellenistic scholars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE.
Yeah, it's amazing to kind of remember that where oral tradition ends is where our kind of literature begins, and that it's sort of it's kind of a cross point that in kind of the span of history. Do you think people find it very unsatisfying to not know exactly who Homer is? Like, can we let that go and just immerse ourselves in the works, or will we always kind of want to have something more concrete?
I mean, you can want it, but you can't have it, right? It's one of those things where, I mean, it's not just modern people who want to have the idea of the author. There are ancient biographies of Homer and of other ancient poets as well, most of which are complete fantasy. I mean, they're based on ancient ideas about what Homer should have been. They're many centuries later than the composition of the poems themselves. They show us something about what ancient readers thought about the Homeric poems, but they're not actually evidence for a particular guy who had these particular experiences. I mean, I think we just have to let go of the idea that the only way to read is biographical reading, because of course that's not the only way to read. A poem can be interesting in itself without us knowing anything about the poet. In antiquity, Homer was known not just as Homeros, but also as ho poietes, the poet. If you don't name the poet, you know it's Homer. He's the
And
capital Pi poet.
why Homer and not any of the other oral traditions? I mean, why is he? I mean, I'm just people just have to make peace with it, and I say he, I suppose, in this
Why
situation.
are
But
these two poems? I mean, let's focus on the text, right? Because that's what
yeah,
we have. Yeah.
yeah. So why were this set of texts so much more fundamental and foundational than? I mean, presumably there are other oral traditions that have been committed to writing. I mean, we do know that we had Hesiod, and there's plenty of other works. Why does the Odyssey and the Iliad continue to sort of resonate so deeply?
Canonicity and how does some texts become canonical and others not is always a cluster of reasons, right? There's always things to do with the texts themselves, but then also things to do with the receiving culture. In the case of the Homeric poems, we're told that a tyrant of Athens, Pisistratus, in the 6th century, made some kind of legislation that at the Panathenaia, at this big festival, the poems of Homer should be performed, as opposed to other poems. And we don't actually know what exactly was the text of Homer that Pisistratus was legislating about. Did it mean the whole of the Iliad and the Odyssey exactly as we have them, or was it somehow different? But that suggests that at least by the 6th century, there was a sense that these two poems are special, the ones associated with the name of Homer. The poems of Hesiod were also very, very well known and regularly performed in antiquity. But Homer was the Iliad and the Odyssey, in contrast to these various lost poems, which date from a little bit later than the Homeric poems, which are known as the cyclic poems. They were understood by many readers. We have evidence, for instance, of what our friend Aristotle thought about the relationship of the cyclic poets to the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Aristotle's account of them suggests that part of the answer is people thought the Homeric poems were just way better, way more interesting, because in contrast to the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have really interesting narrative structures, for instance, in the way that the Odyssey doesn't begin at the beginning of Odysseus's journey. It begins with Telemachus, and we have this strange in medias res structure. We're told about the summary of another lost poem, the Cypria, which also was about the Trojan War, that it was much more of a blow by blow. At the beginning, there was this conflict. There was this conflict between these goddesses. They all wanted the apple of discord. Zeus had a plan to reduce the human population. Let's go step by step. Then what happened? Then it was the judgment of Paris, and Paris abducted Helen. And then the Trojan War broke out, and just blow by blow in a way that was narratively less coherent, at least according to Aristotle. I think it's also, so part of it is just, these are really great poems, and they're great, and they were actually, I would argue, very original in their time, and that the ways that they're taking a very strange and creative approach to a pre-existing tradition is part of why they're so fascinating. And I think also the ways that both of the Homeric poems, which are based on pre-existing tradition and myth, but are reinventing those traditions for a specific cultural moment of Pan-Hellenism. So they're poems that are about how can people from all over the Greek-speaking world work together, or maybe they can't. Maybe they're going to do an Achilles and Agamemnon and have a terrible falling out, and Greek speakers will be falling out with each other, which is happening in each of these poems. And then also in the Odyssey, this question of how can Greeks interact with non-Greeks. Those themes continue to really resonate with people throughout antiquity of how do we relate to both people who are like us culturally and linguistically and people who are not like us. Those themes, and then also the themes of human universals like rage and grief, are so precisely and deeply imagined in these poems that I think they sort of continued to find new listeners and new meanings in different moments of both antiquity and then obviously modernity.
Yeah, I think the Pan-Hellenistic aspect of it is always really fascinating. And that's one of the things that, as a casual reader, I would not have picked up without speaking to professors and those who work more intimately with the text, like yourself, to be able to sort of realize, okay, this is a reference to this group of people. And, the catalog of the ships is almost, it's an opportunity for bards to be like, here's your shout out, like bring everybody in the audience in, make sure that everybody's like participating. Um, and the idea of the modernity of the structure of the text, I mean, that seems like a complete hypocritical thing to say, the modernity of these ancient texts, but to the modern reader, the in media res, that kind of the format is just seems so modern. It's kind of crazy to realize that these texts are thousands of years old, and yet they still feel engaging with regards to like how we tell a story, and still keep it really interesting and innovative. It's
Right.
to
I mean, I
me,
think we
it's
have this idea that,
mind-boggling.
of course, ancient texts must be unsophisticated in either their narrative or their psychology. And that's not actually true. Many ancient texts are not at all unsophisticated. And the idea that if it's sophisticated, that means modern, that doesn't actually follow, right? Ancient texts could be just as sophisticated in their modes of storytelling as modern texts can be.
Well, and I think that's an important misconception and misapprehension to kind of overcome when telling people about the classics. You're like, no, no, really, that's cool, I promise.
Yes.
But you were bringing up some of the themes, and I think it would be interesting to kind of carry on a little bit more on that topic because, as you mentioned, these were themes that were kind of important in the ancient world, but obviously continue. I mean, it's not like anger has gone away. So,
Mhm.
how is the theme of, for instance, rage depicted in the Iliad versus the Odyssey? What's kind of a key component of how that emotion is portrayed?
Yeah, I mean, I think just sort of picking up on what we were saying before about these ancient texts are subtle, sophisticated, powerful, emotionally affecting, no matter which time or place you live in. But then there are also ways that they feel, to me, both emotionally truthful, and part of the fascination is also that they can be so emotionally truthful and also in some ways so alien, right? I mean, that the way that Homeric characters experience rage and grief through their bodies and through the idea that a Homeric person has a thumos, which is this, in the center of you, but it's also the seat of your consciousness and the seat of your rage, your intentionality. We may think that's up here, but in fact, no, it's in your thumos if you're a Homeric person. And then also these ideas about all emotions are experienced physically in the way that the Homeric poems talk about them. People are often surprised by how much crying the male warriors do, and does that mean that they're somehow wimps? And I don't think that's actually true. That they're presented as being overcome physically by either grief or rage or even joy. These things are far more fully experienced in the body and expressed in the body in these narratives. I think the poems are also just very powerful in terms of how they represent this really close relationship between rage and grief. I mean, the Iliad in particular is, of course, all about that, all about the way that Achilles makes that transition from one kind of rage to another kind of rage, and then to a different experience of loss, which is grief, as opposed to I think I can get something back out of this by destroying something else. And then in the Odyssey, there's a different relationship to both loss and recovery and rage, because Odysseus is a different kind of hero from anyone. Um,
Oh, sorry. I accidentally muted you. 1 second, Emily. Let me get you back.
okay,
Okay, yeah, there, you're there.
okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm not sure when I got muted, but Odysseus, of course, is very angry for a lot of the Odyssey, but he's an extraordinary, within the panoply of Homeric heroes, he's extraordinary for his ability to inhabit namelessness and to hide his feelings for much longer than anyone else among his comrades can do, such that he can hide both his grief and rage and present himself as nobody or as nameless. And so the sort of revelation of actually I am Odysseus and I'm very angry is part of what the satisfaction of that revelation in book 22 is. So it's, in a way, it's an opposite journey from the journey of Achilles, where we know right from the start he's really upset and really angry. With Odysseus, we know what he feels, but in terms of how he shows his feelings, it's a really slow burn.
It's interesting to me when you're reading it and you see how many times Odysseus is like sobbing and
Mhm.
crying
Yeah.
in a way that I think our sort of modern conception of like a warrior or a hero is not this guy just like breaking down, but he's like full on breaking down regularly even. It's kind of almost shocking, I think, to a modern reader.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not supposed to be shocking, but of course it is, because our norms, I mean, in many modern cultures, are that grown-ups in general, and maybe men in particular, aren't supposed to cry as much as Homeric men do cry. But of course, Odysseus, I mean, the fact that we first encounter him on the island of Calypso, weeping and gazing out at the fruitless sea and wishing to see just the smoke that rises from Ithaca, it's both extremely moving. We understand so much about his how he feels and his situation just from that imagery of his tears and the fact he's sort of melted with tears and that his gaze is towards something that he can't see and he's not going to see for a really long time. And we get to see that grief. I mean, part of what I think is so powerful about that scene, but then this is, I think, quite characteristic of Homer, is that we're told so much, and then there's also this sort of resonant absence as well, that we're shown both he longs to see the smoke rising from his own house, but we're not told what exactly does that mean to him? Does he mostly want to see his son? Does he mostly want to see his wife? Is it mostly about being back in a place where he can have kleos? He can have a version of eternal fame and honor, which of course he can't when he's under the will of a goddess who will always be more powerful than him. And the poem sort of allows us to leave space for each of these possible things that home means. And we're not going to understand fully what does it mean to be there with the smoke of Ithaca for many, many more lines of the poem.
So for yourself, as somebody who can kind of do a really deep dive into the language, because I'm presuming most of us do not have that level of knowledge of ancient Greek. And I can remember my own university days. I'm glad that there are people like you who exist who can really immerse yourself in the language and to do this, I think, very important work of continuously bringing up new translations that kind of keep it fresh and relevant in a way that most of us can't. So I think it's so important. But as it's like almost like a superpower, what kind of insights can you get by working so intimately with the original text and with your knowledge? Like when you're reading it, it's like something that the rest of us can't really do. And you go, wow, this is cool. Or, I would have never realized this.
I mean, there's so much that's so great about Homeric Greek and other ancient Greek too. If anyone has the chance to learn it, you guys should definitely learn it. It's a fantastic language. It's so fun. I mean, I think part of my answer is just the sound of the language. I mean, what I wanted to do as a translator, the primary thing I wanted to do in taking on this project of translation was to make sure that I was doing something or other to echo the musicality and the traditional verse form of the original poetry, which is composed in dactylic hexameter. It's a really beautiful rhythm.
Do you want me to take
And
it back?
okay, should I pause while people are
No,
muting?
you're good. You're
Okay.
good.
Yes, and so I wanted to use a traditional verse form in English. Maybe I'll just do the beginning of the Iliad so you can hear a little bit of it, and then we can talk a little bit about that or whatever other passage you want
Perfect.
to do.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Menin naedatha a peleia do Achilleos, ulamanen, hemuria kaio salgia theca, polas difthimus psukasa idi poriapsin, hero on, autusta heloria chuke kunesin, oio noisita daita, dioste teleto bule. Exudeta prota, diaste tenerisanta, atredesta anaxandron, kai dios Achilleus. So I sort of tried to lean into the rhythm because I hope you can sort of hear what a dactylic hexameter is. It's a dactylos is a finger which has a long joint and then two shorter joints. So it's la 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 menina edetha apelea do akeleos. And it's that rhythm which of course is carrying the performance oral poetics along. And that there were particular positions in the line that the oral composer would have had. Is he going to be swift-footed or is he going to be son of Peleus? So I'm trying to echo some elements of that in the rhythmicality of my translation. Should I do mine?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
please.
Okay.
And I can just tell you,
I guess
you're
part
big
of my
fans
answer to your
here.
question is what you're missing is I tried really hard, but it's still not going to be as good as the sound of the original. Okay, so this is my version of that same passage, which is called the proem to the Iliad. It's just the first 7 lines. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. So I wanted to try and echo both the rhythmicality, the fact that there's so much alliteration and assonance in the original, there's so much poetic sound, and that also there are these sort of sonic balances of here's Agamemnon, here's Achilles. They're balanced in the lines, they need to sound balanced, but also in conflict at the same time. And then just maybe one more detail about so I see there's one person commenting on the banquet for the birds. I can comment on one textual thing and one translation thing. Banquet for the birds is an example of a phrase in Homer where we know of two alternative ancient readings. I told you already that there were scholars at the Library of Alexandria who are the sources of our medieval manuscripts and then of our modern texts of Homer. We have evidence of their arguments with each other when one scholar would say, oh, my text says this. I think that's a better reading than that. You shouldn't put that in that line. This other scroll that we have says that. We know in that first passage that there were two ancient readings of that thing about the birds. It's either oio noisi te pasi, so that the dead people are going to be eaten by all the birds, or else it's oio noisi te daita, a banquet for the birds. It seems to me that Banquet for the Birds is a better reading because it echoes what's been said about the dogs, which is they're anthropomorphized, they're like human warriors, they're getting spoils from the battlefield, and the birds are also like human warriors, they're getting this honorific, heroic warrior feast, a banquet. Also, I liked that I could get some alliteration in, given that the line in the original is so alliterative. So that's one sort of set of questions as a translator. I'd have to both think about what am I going to do with it in English, but also in some cases, if there are two options for what even am I translating, as there are with that, I have to make a choice about that because I can't translate both at the same time. Though in fact, the Lattimore translation does translate both of those in a slightly weird way. And then the other thing I just wanted to emphasize about that passage is that sometimes it's difficult to convey conceptually weird things in the original. So in that passage, there's this idea that as a result of the wrath of Achilles, which is going to be so deadly, so devastating, that people will be turned into dog food and bird food, it will be the people who will be turned into dog food and bird food, autus in the original, and then the psyche will be sent down to Hades. So there's an idea that there's the person himself, he's getting eaten by dogs now. And it's really horrible for him, great for the dogs. So if the dog's hungry, it's a good, happy ending. But the assumption is that most people listening to this poem and understanding it are probably going to be the humans rather than the dogs. But then that's the people are being eaten. And then what's going to Hades? We might think, oh, it's your soul, it's your essence that's going to Hades. But that's only the psyche, which is within the Homeric concept. That's this shade or ghost. It's related to the self, but it's not the whole self. The primary self is what's still on the battlefield when you're dead. So I actually think that's really important for the translation to try to convey that, because you're not going to understand anything about the poem in terms of why does it matter so much that the Greeks recover the dead Patroclus in book 17. That whole book is about recovering the dead. Why does it matter so much that Priam, the king of Troy, makes that terrible, dangerous, impossible journey through the enemy encampment in book 24 to get his dead son back from the person who killed him and kiss the hands that killed his own children? This is a horrible thing. Why is he motivated to do that? If it's just a dead body, why would you bother? If it's getting your son back and your son can come home at last, there's nothing more important than that. There's nothing more important than honoring the dead, because the dead are people. And so I think translations that say the bodies, the souls, I've looked at several English translations, many of which do that, many of which say the bodies are eaten by the dogs, the souls go to Hades. I think that misleads the reader about what's at stake in this poem. And what's at stake is what happens to people, including dead people.
Yeah, and I think, as you point out, I mean, making what happens to a dead body so visceral, so horrific, like being a banquet for birds and dogs. I mean, it's not just, oh, you've died. It's like you're being devoured. I mean, it's
you're being devoured, and also the honor. I mean, the fact that it's an honorific term. Banquet really matters I mean, dice in Homeric Greek, it's not just food, it's honorific food. It's a portion that isn't just going to feed your your physical self, it's going to feed your social honor self, and that also really matters. So it's humiliating as well as presumably painful to be left on the battlefield.
Now, one of the sort of missions usually at Classical Wisdom is to sort of connect the ancient world to our modern world and to sort of see what lessons lie therein. And I know that sometimes can be a bit tricky in a way when you're talking about great literature, and sometimes the more important aspect of the classics is just asking the questions rather than specific elements inside. But from your experience of being sort of immersed in the world of Homer, what would you say is some of the kind of takeaways or insights that you can get that can actually be applicable in your day-to-day life, or just not in your day-to-day life necessarily, but for us navigating our complex lives, there's sort of insights from Homer that can help us.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate both the question and the caveats because, of course, I mean, if these two great epic poems could be summarized satisfactorily on a coffee mug, then why do we read them? I mean, I think part of the lesson is the experience and just being immersed in, many hours of something both so profound and so, in some ways, so relatable, in some ways so alien. I think you get changed by that experience, and that lesson in itself is really important. I think that's also sort of part of, even if you were in antiquity, there's a way the Homeric poems are inviting you to think about societies that aren't quite yours, even if you are an ancient person, because you actually don't know all about the society of the gods on Mount Olympus, but the Iliad will take you there to these alien societies. I think in terms of things that these poems teach you, if you were interviewing Plato, he would say, they teach you terrible things. They teach you to sympathize with horrible people. They teach you to care about things you shouldn't care about. They teach you to wallow around in grief. They teach you to indulge in your rage. They teach you to that societies can get destroyed by people who are obsessed with their honor. I think it's worth taking seriously ancient readings of Homer, including hostile ancient readings of Homer that take these poems seriously in terms of the ways they're challenging. The ways they're challenging also we might want to think the universe is, and there's a benevolent set of deities in charge of the universe. These poems do not teach you that. They teach you about how terrifying things might be, and the idea that the deities who are more powerful than us what happened to, oh, sorry.
I don't know.
You don't know what that is.
I
Okay.
also do not know what that
Can
is.
make that go away? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
Okay. Yes. But just in terms of positive kinds of lessons, I mean, I think they teach you something or other about the connectedness of multiple societies. I think it really matters that both of these poems are about sort of Greek societies relating to other societies, and how you can't have the whole world. Of course, it's not the same as what we mean by the whole world or the globe, is interconnected in ways that characters within the poems don't always fully see. In the Iliad, we really see how the society of the Trojan city, which is besieged, the society of the Greek encampment, the society of the deities, they are all linked to each other, and that they're ways that the desire for honor, the desire for community, the rage, the grief, the ways that there's push and pull between people or between beings if they're divinities, is both happens within a community and also happens within society, between societies. And similarly in the Odyssey, there's this sense of, in a way the poem imagines, what if a Greek-speaking person were to go as far away as possible from the familiar? Then what would happen? What can remain in? Is there a possibility of either a retention of the self or a retention of cultural values, whether it's values of hospitality and welcoming the stranger, or what is the proper relationship between guests and hosts, and honoring the gods, and justice? Does justice have to mean vengeance? What kinds of models of justice are there? But there's this way that...
All right. Oh, that keeps happening. Apologies, Emily. 1 second.
Technical. Okay. Yes.
Yep, you're good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway,
Uh,
community. Community and
yes.
interconnectedness are some of the themes. And also the importance of emotions, taking emotions seriously, which I think we sometimes don't take them as seriously as the Homeric poems do. And we may think, oh, emotions are somehow individual and they're for self-help or psychoanalysis. These poems are not presenting emotions in this way. They're external and they're interactive, and that interactions between people, including through language, really matters.
Now you've mentioned about being immersed in the language and in the books, and that experience changes you just by reading it, by kind of transporting to another time. So I want to ask about being transported to another place. And, you know, because this story does take place in an actual location in the Mediterranean, in this world of islands and seas and ruins and cities. How do these places shape the story? How do they give tangibility, I suppose, to these epics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult question because on some level, these poems are set in sort of real landscapes, but they're only sort of real, right? I mean, they're landscapes that kind of correspond to real life. There was a real life city of Troy. It was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Was there a single one-off Trojan War? Not exactly, right? There's a way that these poems are about a fantasy version of history. There's a folk memory of there were Mycenaeans and then their civilization collapsed. There were these great palaces and we see their ruins. And if you were a person living in archaic Greece, you would see the ruins of the great palaces. So to me, that part of what these poems are about is this sort of partial relationship to it's almost real geography, it's almost real history, and yet it's also fantasy geography, fantasy history. Odysseus goes to real places in antiquity. I mean, from a fairly early date, people sort of tried to map the journey of Odysseus onto real life geography. So here's the Cyclops, that's actually Sicily, but the poem never tells you that. Here's real life Ithaca, but where was the real palace of Odysseus? In fact, there's a lot of room for doubt about whether whoever composed the Odyssey had ever been to anywhere near Ithaca, because these poems certainly originated in the eastern part of the Greek-speaking world, not in the parts represented by Ithaca and Kephallonia. And then similarly, I already said that Troy is this amazing archaeological site. It's a real place. But then there are some elements of Homer's Troy that, of course, you can't find. People have tried to find those hot and cold springs that are such an important landmark when Achilles is chasing Hector around the walls of Troy. But there isn't any evidence there actually were any. It's giving you something that feels vivid within the poetic world. But it seems to me that even if you sort of think maybe the point is not to have an actual literal map of this is what it's like. The look of the sea, the look of the rocks, the look of here are these ruins of an earlier civilization, ruins from Mycenaean palaces, the sense of what is it like being on a boat in the Aegean. The Odyssey in particular is so much about that, about the changes of weather, the changes in the sea, the winds. So many of the similes in the Iliad have to do with the winds battling each other. The winds still blow in the sea, and the wine dark sea still looks all of those different colors that it must have looked 3,000 years ago.
For yourself, what was your experience when you journeyed to some of these places? I mean, I saw you at the very end of the trip. I wasn't able to join you guys on the full trip. But what was the experience for you and maybe some of the attendees when you were actually in these places?
I mean, I find it so moving. To me, there are some places which I've only very recently been to visit, and I've been reading about them, since I've been reading anything more or less. I only went to Ithaca, a few years ago, and it was amazing. It's like such an incredibly beautiful place. I mean, I find it just emotionally very, very moving, as well as obviously mind expanding, interesting, just to learn on the ground about the various archaeological discoveries. There's so much new discovery that's still being made about many of these sites, which is also extremely exciting. But then also just that visceral feeling of I'm in a boat on that same water that was known by the Greeks in Homer, the Greeks of the time of Homer. I'm looking at the rosy-fingered dawn. Here's Rhododactylos Eos, and it's Rhododactylos Eos coming up again and again and again. Rosy-fingered dawn is dawning again over the wine dark sea, and it's something just so beautiful about that. And
Yeah,
I
and
would
it's
also
very
want to say that
yeah.
there's just I think I've done 2 Thalassa trips. The archaeological guide was so good. I think I feel like the Thalassa classical wisdom people really know how to pick a good, well-informed guide. who knows
Yeah,
what they're
and his
doing.
name was Aristotle, which is
Yes,
just too cool.
yes, he's awesome.
I
Yeah,
remember he did, yeah, the very first one I
yeah,
remember, one of the attendees wrote to me and they were like, "Oh my God, Aristotle is awesome."
yes,
I
he
was
really
like,
is awesome. He's so good. Yes, yeah.
and it's you've had the experience now of doing one of the cruises and one of the land journeys, and this year, which one it will leaving July 1st, I think, to the 13th, will be on the cruise again. But this one I think is like a state-of-the-art boat that
Oh,
looks
okay. I didn't know. Okay.
very, very epic in and of itself. But you know what I like is they're still smaller trips. It's not like one of those big gaudy type things. It was very classy. And I remember talking to everybody and they were sort of like, I'm not normally like a tour person, but I love this. So I think
Yeah.
it definitely seems like one of those experiences where you get to actually be immersed in the place with people who are interested, with people who are knowledgeable. And I think this next trip, you guys will be going to Greece, the Greek islands, and Turkey, which I don't think you did last year. So that's kind of a nice addition for getting that whole spread of the
Mhm.
East and the West. Um, yeah, and I know this year you'll also be doing quite a few lectures and talking about, I mean, are there certain locations or discussions that you're most anticipating for this year's trip?
I honestly haven't fully planned out my lectures for this year's trip yet, so I can't totally tell you. I mean, I will certainly talk about Homer and about the relationship of the Homeric poems to the geography and the landscape that we'll be traveling through. I will certainly talk about translation challenges within the poems. I'm actually doing a revision of my Odyssey translation right now. I may talk a little bit about that process because I'll be thinking about it all the time. But I'm not totally sure about exactly what I'll say, but I will be sure by the time it comes.
Well, I think it's going to be very, very exciting. And I know, again, from talking to everybody who went last year, they absolutely loved hearing your insights. And as I said, for the rest of us, getting that kind of insight deep into the language and the history and the words, the philosophy, it's all the difference. I mean, we can go to these places on our own, but not all of us get to go with somebody like you who can explain it all to the rest of us. So it's fantastic. And I can see that there's some of the people who went last year in the audience even. So,
Hello,
um,
everyone.
so I'm going to actually move on to some of the Q&A because we've been getting so many questions. I will give a few more details about this year's trip at the very end for those who are curious. But I actually want to ask a question based on what you just said, because I've actually got a few submitted to us in advance. And one was specifically about the translations which of your translations you would recommend. And the question was, is the new version of the Odyssey still in the works? When we were in Search of Human Homer, you mentioned that you were doing a new edition. And so what should people be waiting for this new edition? And why delve into it one more time?
Yeah, good question. I have not finished it yet, and it will not be ready in time for you to read it for July. So, I mean, I would just read the old one for now. I'm about halfway through. Ideally, it will be published next year. And so the reason I'm doing it's going to be an expanded version with the one that Anya just held up. I confined myself to the same number of lines as the original because I felt that one of the things that I'd experienced as an issue with many of the translations that I'd used with my students was that many of them were so expansive that they sort of lost the pacing of the original. So I wanted to try to just force myself not to do that and not to pad it out and not to use three different words where the original uses only one, because I think there's a real cost to that in terms of how it feels and what the whole experience is. But then I didn't do that with the Iliad. I let myself have a few more lines, and I actually liked it better. I felt that I was able to sort to be a tiny bit less compressed, and the publishers let me be more expansive in the endnotes with the Iliad. So the new edition, which won't be out this year, but probably in about 18 months, is going to be both more lines, less compressed, and more endnotes.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, and I know it's to let authors and translators have a bit of extra space to do their work must be very appreciated.
It
Um,
certainly
the
is, yeah.
the next question actually comes from a young fan of yours, Charlotte, who is only 11 years old. She has submitted this question in advance, and she is the president of the Homer Club in California and is very enthusiastic. And she wanted to ask, and this is just fun, lighthearted one before I get into the deeper questions. How many Greek myth tattoos do you have on your arms?
Oh, good questions. Yes. I have, well, it depends what you think of as a myth. It's a snowstorm in Philadelphia, so I'm wearing a sweater. I can't show you all my tattoos right now. I have you can see my octopus, which is sort of supposed to, or cuttlefish is supposed to be inspired by the simile in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is clutching to the rocks. But of course, it's also based on the Minoan amazing vases that have the octopus imagery. And then I thought if I have an Odysseus tattoo here, then I need to have an Achilles tattoo here. So here are the immortal horses of Achilles on my other arm. They don't really go well with the watch, but that's okay. I have a rose and a sun for rosy fingered dawn here. I have a ship. I have an owl and a hippocamp because I wanted to represent both Athena and Thetis for the two epics. Anyway, that's a little bit of a sample. I have a couple of others, but it's maybe enough.
And my family were big fans of cephalopods, so I
Good,
definitely that's
good.
going to be
Yes,
my favorite, if I may have one. Is
good.
a question, would you describe Odysseus as a stoic?
Um, the Stoics thought of Odysseus as, a precursor to themselves. I mean, obviously it's anachronistic, right? Stoicism as a philosophy emerged in the Hellenistic period, many centuries after the composition of the Odyssey. But of course, the people who were developing the philosophy of Stoicism knew the Homeric poems backwards, and there was both a great interest in Odysseus among the Stoics and also great interest in other mythological character Heracles. I mean, the Stoics actually were more interested in Heracles than in Odysseus because the single-mindedness of Heracles, where he's battling all the monsters, which can be reinterpreted as the false passions, the false beliefs. Allegorically, the myths associated with Heracles and the saving the world through getting rid of the monsters is easier to assimilate with Stoic models of arete or virtus than the clever wiliness, metis of Odysseus was. But of course, there are elements of Odysseus which are sort of assimilable to Stoicism. The first published translation of the complete Odyssey and Iliad was by the great verse dramatist George Chapman in the early 17th century. So this is also just going back to the question of why has everyone always read Homer? They haven't always read Homer. There's a real discontinuity in the reception history. The Odyssey was not translated into English and most other vernacular languages until the early modern period. But the translation of the Odyssey, in particular by George Chapman, he was very much interested in Stoicism and interested in sort of the reinvented forms of Stoicism that were popular in the early modern period, which were sort of fusing Stoicism with versions of Christianity. And Chapman's Homer is sort of explicitly in some of his notes on the poem, he's explicitly trying to present the patience, the enduringness, the stubbornness, the sort of I am definitely going to go fulfill my journey, and I'm not going to go on about it and whine about my feelings and let my feelings distract me from the journey. There were ways that readers like Chapman could find affinities between Odysseus read in that way and Stoicism, even though I think it doesn't apply to there are elements of the poem that don't fully fit that.
It's amazing how much power a translator has, and it's not until you work with a text do you appreciate that, especially with ancient Greek, because I mean, in Homeric Greek, there's so many ways you could go. I mean, every word has like six different possibilities, so it becomes quite like an elaborate matrix of decision that, I mean, you have control, really, as you say, to shape it in a way. Um, could you speak briefly about the role of the gods in taking sides during the war in Troy? I don't know if that's a brief
Sure.
question, but
I'm not sure what kind of thing the questioner wants me to say about the gods. There's so much to say about them. I mean, the Iliad, of course, is, as we've already said, based on long pre-existing traditions, and those traditions already had sort of baked in traditions about which sides were each of the gods on. The listener to the Iliad is assumed already to know, okay, there was the judgment of Paris, and both Athena and Hera were very angry that the Trojan prince Paris selected the goddess Aphrodite, goddess of sex, rather than either of them. So, of course, they're angry at Troy and want to destroy Troy. There's also the sort of backstory myths about the fact that Poseidon and Apollo were sort of hired by the earlier king of Troy, Laomedon, to build the magical, divinely strong defensive walls of the city, and then Laomedon failed to pay them. And not paying a god for his work, that's actually really bad. And the treachery of the Trojans was then sort of part of that body of myths because of the treachery of Laomedon. So Poseidon and Apollo have this rage against the Trojans for that reason. But then the Iliad also just doesn't spell out most of those myths in the backstory, right? We're just assumed to understand. Of course, Hera wants this city to fall as soon as possible, whereas Zeus is more ambiguous in his allegiances, and he understands that it's been apportioned long ago that this city will fall. But the plan of Zeus, to which we've been introduced in the first lines of the poem, is about the fall of the city, but it's also about the delay to the fall. So there's this sort of ambiguity about we know the Trojans are going to lose, the gods know it. So why are some of them still fighting for the Trojans? Isn't it kind of pointless? But there's real questions about the timing of that. I mean, one of the things I find passages I think is most memorable and interesting about the role of the gods is when Zeus's beloved son Sarpedon is fighting, and it's been foretold that it is his moros, his lot to die at Troy. And we know that there were alternative versions of that myth. There were some stories that existed in the tradition where Sarpedon doesn't die at Troy. And so the poet is sort of playing around with, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? I could tell it either way. And we have this sort of heartbreaking moment when Zeus wants to save his son, but he can't. Hera says it's apportioned this way, and he's going to die. And Zeus weeps tears of blood, and Sarpedon dies. I mean, I guess one thing that maybe one final thing I'll say about the gods is that when I talk about the Iliad, especially the Iliad, but also the Odyssey, but more, the gods are so much more diverse and prominent in the plot in the Iliad. I find students very often sort of think if the gods are involved, that means humans have no agency. That means there's no free will. And I think it's really important to see how the poem doesn't present it in those terms, right? I mean, in that first moment during the quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon, when Achilles is thinking, should I just get out my sword and chop his head off? And then I can express my rage totally directly. Or should I maybe put my sword back and not kill him right now? I could go either way. And Athena pulls him by the hair, and he's astonished to see the goddess behind him. And she puts the idea in his mind, sent by Hera as well, that he shouldn't do it. And he thinks about it and then decides, okay, I'm not going to kill him. And so it seems to me really important that Athena, in that intervention, which is totally typical of the interventions of gods in the Iliad, she doesn't move his hands for him like a puppet and say, I'm going to put your sword hand back into your, make you put it back in the scabbard. Instead, she puts an idea in his mind. So the way that the gods work is in a way like the way humans also influence each other. They influence each other. Gods influence humans, and humans influence humans by speech, primarily.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those examples too of how the ancient world can seem both familiar and very alien. You know, this idea that there's these other influences and the gods. So this question is from Tom Morris, who's a fantastic philosopher as well. And he wrote, during the pandemic shutdown, I reread the Odyssey 4 times and the Iliad twice. After all that, I came to wonder that if there's a sense in which the Iliad is about the power of partnership beginning as it does with the breakup of a partnership, and the Odyssey about the power of purpose. One man confronted with crazy obstacles has such a strong sense of purpose to get home that he overcomes it all. What do you think of those kind of synopses of these two great works?
I love that setup. I mean, I think there's a lot to think about there. I mean, I think that I particularly like the idea of partnership as an essential theme in the Iliad, because of course this sort of central partnership is the partnership between Achilles and Patroclus, and the way that Achilles becomes in a way someone else once he's lost the heteros that he loved. Isoner me kephale is what he says. I loved him equal to my own head. So he's one of a pair, but he's also like a body part. But it's, as the question also suggests, it's not just Achilles and Patroclus, it's also Achilles and Agamemnon, it's also Diomedes and Sthenelus. It's these multiple pairs of not brothers, but quasi-brothers, very, very intimate relationships between a pair of men. And I think the Odyssey is very different in that way, because Odysseus is so insistently represented as he's the only son of an only son. There's one of Laertes, he has just Odysseus, and then Odysseus has just Telemachus. And so there's this interest in the isolation of a man without brothers. And Telemachus is sort of surrounded by these suitors who are anti-brothers. They're not peers. They're these bad kinds of peers. I guess I'm not so sure about the purpose, because I think Odysseus is, I mean, one of his main epithets is polutlas. He's much enduring. He can put up with things, whatever they may be. He can endure things and stick it out. But that epithet doesn't speak to why is he sticking it out. And I think there's a real ambiguity in the Odyssey about the fact that the poem ends multiple times. You know, that and this again was debated and argued about by ancient readers. We know that at least one ancient critic said this poem needs to end with book 23, with the olive tree bed reunion. Husband and wife got back together again. Yay! That's the end of the poem. Why don't we have all this extra stuff? We have all this extra stuff with the psyche of the suitors being led like bats by Hermes to Hades, which I think is such a wonderful scene. I love the imagery of the bats. Then we have the meeting with Laertes in the orchard, where Odysseus, again, even though he's home and you think he doesn't need to, he's still putting on disguises. And then we have the quasi-civil war between the fathers of the dead suitors and Odysseus and his men. So it just seems to me that the poem is presenting us with, he's moving towards something, but then where exactly is the end point? If it's purpose, what is the purpose? And does it ever end? I think it's less clear about that than you might expect it to be. And I actually kind of love the richness of that, where we're being invited to really think about what is the purpose, what is the end goal, what is the self, what is he coming home to? What is a complete nostos, a complete homecoming journey? Does it end with the marriage? Does it end with the father-son relationship? Does it end with the community? Does it end when he's back at being who he was at Troy? He's going to sack another city. This time it's on Ithaca.
I think you just beautifully exemplified how the classics help engage in a debate and a question more than like a wisdom therein, and that the act of questioning leads to more questions, but that's kind of at the heart of the experience.
Yeah.
Speaking of debate, I can see in the chat that there has been a bit of a debate going on with regards to one question, and I can see it sort of resulted in people asking if, please, I could ask this question to get your insights on it. So, no pressure. Okay, so this one's from Eden. She said, I would like how one can enjoy Greek mythology in spite of all the unflinching accounts of brutality against women committed by the gods. And then she uses Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is, of course, later, but still based on a lot of Greek mythology. So I think that specific niche point about whether Greek or Roman can be discarded, I think we can all acknowledge that there's plenty of brutality against women in Greek mythology as well. So how do we sort of, as modern women, navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's brutality against both men and women in these poems and in life, right? I mean, I think if you want to read about something that doesn't require any content warning, then obviously Homer is not a good choice, because it's both, there is both implicitly the whole quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon is about a captured woman and who gets to rape her, right? It is about, and then men's honor, it hinges on who gets to lay claim to this woman who's obviously is being and will continue to be raped, sexually assaulted. And the poem doesn't take us to her experience. It's about the experiences of the men who feel that they've lost not just a captive woman, but social status if they don't have this woman as one of their many rape victims. And of course, that's not the only kind of brutality. And as I was starting off by saying, I mean, there's a lot of eyeball spearing. There's a lot of spears through livers. I guess I'm sort of puzzled a little bit over, I mean, is the idea that every narrative about horrible things is endorsing horrible things? I don't think that's the case, right? I mean, I think it's about, is this poem saying, please go out and spear some eyeballs and kill some people? That's also, but I mean, going back to what I said about Plato, I mean, part of the resistance to both tragedy and the Homeric poems that's articulated in books 3 and 10 of the Republic, part of it is about what even is truthful about mythical poetry, but part of it is about, is this an endorsement of things that are ethically clearly horrible? And I think one can have an argument both, you know, with living people and with Plato about the degree to which these poems are endorsing the actions they describe. I think they're evoking them. And I also think if you want to read literature or listen to literature, listen to poetry that feels truthful, it's not going to feel truthful if there's no rage, no violence, no brutality, because that's part of human experience, including both the experience of suffering and also the experience of wanting to hurt other people. That's part of what humans do when they interact with each other. It's also part of what, if there were gods like these, then that would be what they would do too. It seems to me that it isn't sort of so clear in the Iliad that it's saying you must do this. It's saying this is the kind of thing that happens, and this is how it happens, and you have a greater understanding of it from reading or listening to the poem.
I think it's very well said. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes. We can have a long conversation about the degree to which that's true of Ovid. I think it might be different in different passages and different in different passages of the Metamorphoses. I think some of them are more collusive with the perpetrator's gaze than others. But yeah, that's a longer conversation, and we're supposed to be talking about Homer. Yes.
Yeah, and it is an interesting conversation, and I think one of the things a lot of times with the classics in general, but with this book, it's not an instruction manual, and literature can be either a mirror or a window, and sometimes, I mean, it's showing you what is the reality for many people. So that was brutality against women tragically has been a reality. So pretending that it didn't exist is not doing the victims any justice either. Moving on to a question from Suzanne. She says, so much of both the Iliad and the Odyssey is about fathers and sons. Zeus and Sarpedon, Priam and Hector, Achilles and Peleus, and of course Odysseus and Telemachus. But of course, mothers are also really important. Thetis and Achilles, Penelope and Telemachus. Could you talk a bit about these parent-child relationships?
Love that question. I mean, I feel that this person has already laid a lot out for us. I'm not quite sure where to begin because there's so much to say about all of this. I mean, I think one of the most profound and central themes of the Iliad is about parents trying to help their children and the limitations on what a parent can do for a child, however hard they try. And I think that's the case in the Odyssey as well, in slightly different ways with Odysseus and Telemachus. One of my favorite passages there are so many favorite passages in the Odyssey is when Odysseus and Telemachus reunite, and we have an amazing simile in which they cry together, and their tears are like the cries of birds of prey who have come back to their nest and their chicks have been killed. And so it's this image of bird parents who've lost their chicks. And that's like what it's like when this father has found his son. So you would think that's not like that. And yet it is, because it's just defining a relationship that's built on loss and grief and all these years of not being together. And also once they are together, what can they do together? They can fight. So I think there's a sense of the pain as well as the love in parent-child relationships, which is really profound. The whole plot of the Iliad is about a mother, Thetis, who's doing her very best to restore a loss for her mortal son, in the full knowledge that she can't give him what she really wants to give him, which is immortality, and that no matter what she does, he's still going to die. But she tries to mitigate that loss by the sort of paradoxical plan that she forms with Zeus, whereby while Achilles doesn't fight, the Greeks get massacred, which is Achilles' way of demonstrating to his fellow Greeks that they really need him, and therefore they need to honor him above all other warriors, and they shouldn't diss him the way that Agamemnon has dissed him. But of course, that plan backfires, because rather than making Achilles happy because he gets so much honor, it results in devastating grief for Achilles, because one of the Greeks is Patroclus, who is killed while Achilles is wearing Achilles' armor. So there's this way that it's sort of monkey's paw, where the mother tries to help the child, and all she does is increase his grief and also hasten his death, because of Achilles' grief, he's then furious at all the Trojans and at Hector, and goes to fight Hector, which will soon bring on his own death. The reconciliation of the quasi-father Priam with the quasi-son Achilles. Part of what's so moving about that scene is that this son will never see his real father again, because he's going to die very soon. And this father is going to see his dead son, but that son's not going to come back to life. So there's this way that the father and son relationship, which is the result of this mother-son relationship, both of those relationships are built on grief, as well as on this terrible desire to help across the generations.
Another good question from Suzanne, and this one is in reference to what you first mentioned about the Homeric word for feast versus banquet at the very beginning. Is that like a sacrifice given to the gods? Is that part of the imagery and reference?
I mean, one could read it as the gods being involved, but I actually think the fact that Zeus is mentioned, right? We have that resonant reference to the plan of Zeus, Dios de teleia boule, the plan of Zeus unfolded or was being fulfilled. Zeus, of course, likes it if there is a banquet where he gets all the servings. One could imagine maybe some of those birds are eagles. But the poem doesn't spell any of that out. It doesn't sort of say this is a banquet that is a sacrifice. And I think the idea of reading it that way doesn't fully make sense, because sacrifice is what humans do to generate their relationships with gods, right? It's about humans killing animals in order to have a sense of being able to share natural resources with the divine. Whereas in the first lines of the Iliad, those the human beings are not being killed as a sacrifice. They're being killed in war, and the animals just happen to get this honorific banquet and spoils as a result of it. But I mean, I think that also just a longer answer to that would have to do with just how do we interpret the plan of Zeus and Zeus's ambiguous perspective on all of this.
With moving on to another question, because we've got so many, so I want to make sure I can get as many in as I can. This one is much is said about how peoples develop new words for colors. Any stories about how you translated color words?
Yes. I mean, ever since in the 19th century, the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, wrote a little, I kind of wish we were living in a world where more political figures wrote monographs about Homer. But back in the day, that's what they did. They went and studied classics at Eton and Oxford, as they still do in the UK. But after doing that, Gladstone wrote this little book about Homer, which included a sort of foundational study of color words in the Homeric poems. So it's a much discussed thing, the fact that Homeric color words don't fully correspond to the whole palette of modern English color words. This is paralleled by several other languages. Like pre-industrial societies very often have far fewer distinct languages for color tone words than we do. So there are words that are used for both the color of oxen and the color of the sea. And we think those are two different colors. There's a word that applies to both green and yellow. We think that's two different colors, but nope, it's the same thing. And also there are words which seem to suggest both color, but maybe primarily degree of sparkliness. So how exactly do I translate that if my vocabulary disambiguates color in different ways from the ways that the original disambiguates color? The word kuaneos is used for blue enamel. People very often say there's no word for blue in Homer, which is true in the sense that there's no word that applies only to blue things we would call blue and to no other things that we would call some other color. But then does that mean I can't use the word blue? If an English speaker referring to this using a color word would use the word blue, I don't think it necessarily does mean that. I experimented, especially in the Odyssey translation, with maybe I can use slightly unusual or surprising color words where I can sort of try to get the reader adjusted, or get the listener, if you're listening to the audiobook, adjusted to the idea that the visuals of this poetic landscape are not quite what you think. So I think I use indigo. There's a word that connotes the color of violets. So violet is, of course, a word that we can use for color. And it sort of reminds you that we wouldn't necessarily think the sea, that's the same color as violets, but maybe it is. Or maybe it's the same color as enamel. And also maybe it's the same color as oxen if you look at them squinting a little bit.
Yeah, it's amazing how we have to kind of place ourselves in that ancient world and think of what colors that they had at their disposal for paints and in nature. And I mean, we have a lot of colors that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to see. I mean, that we can get from synthetic creations or from different parts of the world. Palettes look so different in the tropics than they do in the Nordic countries and in the Mediterranean. So
that's
they
true.
would
I
be
mean, I guess it's
inspired by
not so
different things.
surprising that they didn't have a word for like neon green,
Yeah.
right? Right? Because they didn't have neon lights. But I guess I'm sort of skeptical of the idea that because the language is different, that means their optic nerves were different, right? I mean, they presumably they saw the same world that we see. They saw the same sea, but they described it, individuated it differently.
Well, I don't know. I'm just
We could have a
riffing
whole debate
here,
about that. Yes.
riffing here just for a second. But I think about the nature of language that, when a child's born, they have a full category of sounds in the International Phonetic Alphabet that they can distinguish from. And that I think around 6 months to about 2 years, we lose that ability. And you think of a Japanese speaker, the allophones L and R are indistinguishable to them because and we have that as well in English for different sounds, and every language does. And one of the difficulties when you're studying linguistics is trying to attune your ears and your mouth to make and hear sounds that you do not make in your own language. I mean, if it can happen audially, you would think that we can have like a restriction of things that like we have all the possibilities, but if it's not happening in our day-to-day lives, we just don't see that distinction. I mean, we can if it's pointed out to us, but until it's pointed out to us, maybe we don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely find that if I've been doing some visual art, I see the world differently, and I think I mean, people sometimes think of the color issue as a special case all by itself, but I think as you're kind of saying in terms of linguistics, I don't think it's so different from all kinds of other differences between different languages. I mean, for instance, Homeric Greek, like many languages, distinguishes between your sister-in-law who's married to your brother versus like these different kinds of family relationships. We just have a general in-law thing as opposed to different subcategories of cousins and in-laws, which are different words in Homeric Greek. And then sort of similarly in Homeric Greek, there's a clear distinct, maybe going back to the partnership point, ancient Greek has both a singular and a plural for verbs, but it also has a dual. So if you want to say these two people were doing this, you're using a different verb form from if it's many people, more than two, or if it's one person. And so constantly thinking about, was that two or was that many, is something that is baked into the language. Whereas if you're speaking English, you're not constantly thinking, were there only two of us then? But of course, it's not that you wouldn't be able to say, yes, that was the two of us. But I also, I mean, this is one of many difficult things that I wrestle with as a translator, because in English it's going to sound clunky if I translate every single dual by saying, and then they both, the two of them, went along the road being just the two of them, like that. but I also need to sometimes, I mean, I do put in both as much as I feel the reader can stand to try to remind or just give a signal that the two-ness is really being marked here, but not in a clunky way because it's just a verb ending.
Yeah, it is fascinating though how language can shape the way you think. And I usually use as an example how in Spanish something can break itself. Like you say, se cayó. And it
Mhm.
means like, so if you break a vase, in English though, we don't have that. Somebody has to always be at fault. And
Yes.
they've done experiments with that where like somebody walks past and they knock over by accident a vase, and the English speaker will remember who was the agent of breaking it
Oh,
more
I
than the
love
Spanish
that.
speaker because they can
Yes.
see the accident. There isn't an agent
Yes.
built in the
It's
language.
just, I love that. Yes. And similarly about the fact that Greek has a middle as well as an active and passive, which presumably also just cues you into thinking about action and agency in a different way, where you can do an action at a distance. If I get somebody else to educate my son, that's different from if I'm teaching him myself or I'm being taught. And that's an absolutely natural thing to be thinking about the possibility of these different modes of action, including action at a distance or through someone else, which similarly doesn't really exist for the English speaker as the first kind of thing you think about in terms of action.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, to pivot just a little bit, you mentioned the audiobook,
Mhm.
and I have a question specifically from Lori regarding that. Was Claire Danes instructed in how to read the Odyssey as she read the audiobook? I did not know Claire Danes read the audiobook.
She read the audiobook. I
That's
was
awesome.
very, very glad that she was able to do it. I had a brief phone conversation with her, but I didn't do instruction. I haven't listened to all of it. I've heard that she did a good job. I didn't do any sort of detailed. This is how I want this line to sound. She did her own thing. She's a obviously very well trained actor, and she knows what she's doing.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
did
I can't.
so Audrey McDonald did the Iliad. I didn't directly talk to her. I think she's also an amazing actor, singer. I mean, obviously, um, she, unlike Danes, did ask for me to send an audio recording of the whole glossary with all the names. So she very much wanted to check that the stresses are landing in the places that I'm intending for the meter to sound right.
So sticking a little bit with the Hollywood theme, I'm sure you were anticipating this question from Sahar. How do you feel about the upcoming film, The Odyssey, written and directed by Christopher Nolan? Do you think he'll do the epic justice?
I'm excited that so many more people are going to be wanting to read Homer as a result of Nolan doing his epic. So I think that's wonderful from that. Just in terms of, I as somebody who love Homer, I want as many people as possible to be engaged with these amazing poems. I don't think it's the case that any one single cinematic adaptation is going to do everything that one could possibly wish for as an adaptation of this great poem. And presumably, even if it's a very long Hollywood epic, it's not going to be 24 hours worth of long, where there's going to be inevitably decisions about what to prioritize in the narrative, how to interpret the narrative. But I'm excited just to have more people engaged with the story. I mean, even if I know there will be things I won't like about it, but there'll also be things that will be super interesting about it. I also don't think I can fully comment on it because I haven't seen it yet. When I've seen the trailer that everyone's seen, but I'm not going to do a whole in-depth commentary about a movie that's not out yet. But I think it's exciting just that there's so much interest in going back to these ancient stories and reinventing them in creative ways. I'm not sure if anyone here watched the Return, which was another, I thought, pretty interesting movie adaptation of the Odyssey, which had Juliette Binoche and Ralph Fiennes together again many years after The English Patient. And I thought the acting in that was really, really good. So,
Yeah,
but
it's
I'm
been
guessing it's going to be extremely different from the Nolan because The Return was a very, very stripped down, no magic, no special effects kind of movie. And I think the Nolan's going to be the opposite. So I think it's also just exciting to see how there can be very different interpretations of the same ancient material.
Yeah, I'm excited to see Christopher Nolan's approach because I've always, when I've tried to explain the difference between the Greek tragedians, I always compare Euripides to Christopher Nolan, and that he like takes a story that everybody knows and kind of makes it a bit grittier and raw. So it's kind of fun to see.
Mhm.
It's in my maybe convoluted mind, it's sort of like Euripides doing the Odyssey. No.
Euripides already
Which,
did the Odyssey. It's called The Helen. It's a great play.
oh,
You know,
yeah, yeah, I got it.
yeah.
Excellent point. Speaking of one other version, this is from Dr. Kay Graves. A question I have for Professor Wilson has sorry, the epic, the musical. And if so, what are her thoughts on it as another way for modern people to engage in this text, or perhaps a gateway to people engaging the classics?
I mean, again, I feel like it's so exciting that there are so many gateways nowadays, you know, and that there are so many people excited about this material. I haven't listened to all of it. I've only listened to a little bit of it, so I don't feel I can really comment on Epic the Musical, you know, properly in the way that the true fans can. But I've seen just from my students how much excitement there is from young people about the musical. And I know there's an upcoming, the same person is doing a version of the Iliad, kind of, I think, which I think is also going to be just inspiring a whole new generation. And it doesn't have to be that I personally love every element of it, right? I mean, I listened to a little bit of it and I thought, okay, it's maybe not for me, but it's definitely is for some people. And there are so many ways in. And I love the fact that there are so many ways in, there are so many ways to engage with this material, and there are so many possible gateways where maybe you've been listening to Epic, maybe you've watched the Nolan movie, and then maybe you want to go back and read the texts. And there can be this wonderful loop and interactivity between contemporary reception and the ancient texts themselves.
Yeah, I find it very exciting, and it's quite. I don't want this to sound condescending or rude, but it's almost sweet because it brings like the normal world, I don't know, into our world. So it like opens up the conversation. Like I'll have people come to me and say, "Oh, did you hear there's like a movie coming out about the Odyssey?" I'm like, yeah, I've definitely heard about it. But
Yes.
it's like a point of connection that maybe people who don't normally have as much to talk about with regards to the ancient world can get excited and kind of have an entry into talking about the ancient world. And I think when it comes out, you will just finish this next year's trip, so you'll be fully ready for a full-on Odyssey
Yes.
endeavor. But I want to ask another question, and then I think we're going to be wrapping up pretty soon. You've been very generous with your time, and so this is again specific question from a reader previously submitted. As an English language and literature undergraduate based in Kanakkale, so I apologize for my bad pronunciation of the Turkish, with a deep interest in the Trojan War narratives and their feminist rewritings, I would be interested to know if Professor Wilson has had the opportunity to visit the archaeological site in Troy, either before or during translation. I specifically wonder in what ways physical interaction with the historical topography has informed any translation strategies. Greetings from the land of Polyxena.
Wow. I love that question. That's so moving. Um, I have had the opportunity to visit Troy, and it's such an amazing site. And the relatively new museum is also amazing near the site of Troy. It's an incredible site, and I'm really looking forward to going back. I feel that every time, I mean, I've only been maybe two or three times. Every time I see different things, it's always there's so much to learn. I would say that beyond the sort of very general, I wouldn't say that specific translation choices were influenced by this is what I saw on my trip to the site. Partly because, as I was saying before, I see Homeric landscape in general, including the account of the topography of Troy, as partly quasi-realistic, but also fantastical, poetical, mythological. It's not like I can do a little trip and see this is. I have a colleague who excavated at Troy for 30 years, and one of his funniest stories is about how during the excavations that he was involved with, they found these sort of tubs, which were clearly baths of some kind. And everyone was so excited. We found the baths of Andromache. This is where Andromache was getting the hot baths ready for Hector, which is such a moving moment in the Iliad where she's got the hot bath ready for him when he comes back exhausted and bloody from battle. But he's so far from any hot baths, and he's never going to have a hot bath again because he's dead. And the clothes that she worked for years to make for him are getting ruined because his dead Hector is being dragged behind the horses of Achilles. And that horrifying thing of what do these hot baths mean, and that are tended with so much care. And it turns out the hot baths that they discovered, they were actually Roman imperial fish tanks where they were fish farming. They're from totally different period, nothing to do with Andromache. Everyone wants to project Homer back onto the site of Troy. I think we want to think it feels so real, so it must be real in these literal ways. It is real, but it's not real in quite that way. No.
Yeah, that's a bit of a gut punch, but at the same time, I
It's,
mean,
I love it. I think it actually is. It reminds you about what kind of truth is this poem telling. It's telling the real truth about this marriage, about grief, about planning, and about how the shock of realizing that what she's already grieved for him before when he went left to go to battle. She also she has these two alternative narratives of does she have to grieve or is the hot bath going to be for a living husband? So I think there's a real truth in the story. It's not a truth about any particular bath.
yeah.
And
Well,
similarly,
and
at the palace of Nestor in Pylos, you can see the bath, which is supposedly this is where Telemachus had his bath, right? When he goes to visit Nestor, which I love that. I love the idea that we can imagine a bath given to Telemachus by the women in the palace of Nestor. Is it literally this is on this particular day he had a bath in this particular bathtub? Maybe, probably not in the fish tank though.
oh, let's hope not. Well, Emily, I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I can see there's been so many more questions and so many more comments, and I can see people really enjoyed your readings as well. Specifically, I could see that was definitely a highlight. And so I want
I'm
to
sorry, I
thank
didn't
you.
read more. Could have done more next time. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, I mean, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your scholarship and showing us what it's like to really delve into these works. And you said for more conversation and stuff. I mean, it is a moment for me to remind those that if you do want to continue this conversation and you do want to continue delving into it, we will have that opportunity with the Sea of Homer, which you will be joining with on the 1st of July to the 13th. And as I mentioned already, that's from it's going to be organized by Thalassa Journey, and you have been partaking of it in last year and the year before, not the year before, but the year before that.
Before, yes. And they're amazing tours. It's really wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, the quality of them were just fantastic. And I think this year you guys are going to be going to the Agora, the Acropolis, the museums, Mycenae, Epidaurus, Delos, Ephesus, Istanbul, and you're going to have like a really beautiful trip.
I'm very excited. Yes.
Yeah, and the itinerary I think looks really gorgeous. But I mean, I would just say from my experience of meeting everybody too, one of the huge benefits of both of them have been the quality of the other people on the trip.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah,
And
it's really
and
smart, curious people. It's wonderful. Yeah.
and it's so cool. I mean, I met up with one, I don't remember if you remember Bruce, but and he was in the
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
first one.
Yes.
And we
Yes.
met up with him actually in Melbourne
Oh, wow.
afterwards. And he was talking about, he was like, oh yeah, I'm still friends with everybody.
Oh,
And,
that's lovely. I love
yeah,
that.
we, and
Really
so it's
cute.
kind of
Yes.
like a
Yeah.
real community.
Yeah.
Which I just think is gorgeous,
Yes.
especially for so many of us. I think we kind of have our world of classics, and I know you get to be in university with
Mhm.
students and other professors, but for many of our readers, we get the community here,
Yeah.
online and in these
Yeah.
events. So to actually meet people in real life and geek out together is so much fun.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so
Um,
much for coming, and thank you, Anya, for the lovely conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yes, I had a wonderful time. I will just tell everybody that if you're interested in this year's trip, I'll be sending out information along with this video. And I want to thank everybody for their fantastic questions. As I said, like there are so many more, but we are kind of running out of time. But I love always our classical wisdom community. You guys rock. I keep saying we've got like the nicest corner on the internet. And it's totally true. Just interested and interesting people. So thank you all. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Sean, for helping curate everything in the background. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.